Walking in the Footsteps of Giants, a presentation by the Reverend Adrian Judd about the Book of Pastoral Rule of Gregory the Great. This presentation offers suggestions from Gregory the Great's practical and pastoral theology that could form the theological introduction to a replacement to the Clergy Discipline Measure. This is written in a private capacity. Pope Gregory the Great, a doctor of the Church who sent Augustine on his mission to refound the English Church, had practical and theological advice for his bishops. This advice is contained primarily in the 4 books of the Book of Pastoral Rule. This was completed in about 591 CE, and 10 Anglo-Saxon copies remain, as also 500 other manuscripts. The Book of Pastoral Rule was written to advise a bishop and was influential until the Reformation, and it was given to bishops in France before their consecration in the 9th century. Gregory advised his bishops how to balance pastoral care and discipline of clergy. That balance is difficult, but Gregory gives advice on how to reach it based on his knowledge of the character of prelates and of priests, and the acknowledgement of sinfulness as part of the human condition. As Pope, he spoke with authority. As a man, he was listened to because his life and his learning won respect from the Holy Roman Emperors downwards. Gregory based his work on that of Gregory Nazianzus, linking medieval theology with patristic theology. In the same way, his Book of Pastoral Rule can reconnect the Church of England with its founder's vision and with both medieval and patristic theology, a renewal or ressourcement from its roots. The basic assumptions of the Book of Pastoral Rule are that sin is part of the human condition and that all people sin. He argues from Scripture, finding a spiritual meaning in the texts. Gregory begins with the assumption that a guide is needed for the secular church as the rule of St. Benedict guides religious communities. This Book of Pastoral Rule is intended to be to the secular church what the rule of St. Benedict was to the religious communities. Gregory clearly outlines his evangelical aims of the gospel and the role of bishops in defending the faith from error and correcting sinners. The pastoral charge is to preach the word, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. This is the role of bishops. The difficulty of the cure of souls carried by bishops is not to be underestimated, but to be borne with humility and charity, mindful that they are human like those they pastor. Gregory warns prelates of the need to avoid pride, especially when they are revered by their people, and to promote discipline by their lives as well as their words. Prelates should be generous of spirit in their forgiveness, but that pardon has its limits. Although Gregory predated the Inquisition by over 500 years, he predicted the dangers posed by bishops with excessive zeal in the investigation of sin. He also predated psychodynamic theory by over 1,000 years, in that he was willing to look to motivation and volition as well as actions, because culpability for him lies not in what is done, but also in what is intended, and this requires bishops to have the gift of discernment. Alongside discernment, bishops need humility and awareness of their own sin. We've already mentioned excessive zeal in investigating sin, which comes from a lack of empathy and compassion and ignorance of the humanity of those investigating it. Gregory called bishops to compassion and understanding, mindful of the equality in humanity that bishops share with their people. Other sins that bishops can fall into include holding grudges and losing their temper. Reconciling men and women to God requires the bishop to be approachable, and this has been lost through the operation of the Clergy Discipline Measure. Bishops can act out of undue haste. They can focus on the obvious acts and ignore sins of omission. In correcting error, they are to act with compassion, as our Father in heaven is compassionate. Bishops need to remember that people have breaking points, and that these differ between people and groups of people. Bishops need to remember they do not have authority to break people. To pull a bowstring so taut that it breaks is sinful, and despair, whether temporary or permanent, is not a valid result of discipline. Discipline should not cause despair and separation from God. Such discipline lacks compassion and is dissonant with the aims of discipline, which is to correct sin and to reconcile men and women to God. Gregory recognizes that different people have different breaking points, as different bows have different tensions. Thus discipline should be flexible rather than one size fits all. The nature and character of the one to be disciplined should decide the penalty to be awarded, not the relative gravity of the offence. Gregory illustrates this one-size-does-not-fit-all approach by differentiating psychological types and recommending leniency or heavier penalties depending on the psychology of the sinner. He begins with crasser differentiation that would not pass the Equality Act 2010, such as into men and women, young or old, but he continues by dividing human beings into more refined categories with characteristics shared within the groupings. Mindfulness of any deliberation behind the sin or its impulsivity is important in defining the penalty. The demeanour of the one to be admonished matters, so does their public persona and their inner nature. Gregory categorises people variously depending on their demeanour and suggests treating them differently accordingly. This is because of the reaction they would have to the admonishment, as well as considering the severity of the admonishment. It might be hard to systematise Gregory, but he provides a rationale for all these dichotomies. An obvious thing to consider in clergy discipline is whether the cleric is well, or if they have any sickness, which also constitutes a disability. This would not be argued in mitigation. Indeed, at the moment, mitigating factors can only realistically be argued after agreeing culpability. But it would be argued to give the prelate a broader picture of the cleric and their personal and family circumstances. It's the compassionate thing to do. Gregory tried to avoid high office. He was unsuccessful, but that made him acutely aware of those who do the same. The complexity of sin, both in mind and body, should not be overlooked, nor the attitude of the sinner. The obvious need to repent of sin rather than continue in it reflects a mindset, so does the repetition of sins of thought. One who boasts of his sin speaks volumes about the need for a harsh admonition. But the good deeds of the sinner are not to be overlooked, but are to be expressly known about and considered before a decision is made whether to punish. So too, the face that the one to be admonished presents in public. Are good deeds hidden shyly or exhibited with pride? Are the sins flaunted in public or committed in private? All these things matter. The practical example of a godly life well lived is one which Gregory recommends, since this is the best medicine for those who are spiritually sick and in sin. The life that the bishop leads is the best spiritual guide, not the words he speaks or the judgment he or she makes. Bishops should avoid excessive zeal and anger. Gregory concludes by being mindful of his own sin. He asks his readers to pray for him, lest his pride gets the better of him. To be a bishop is not easy, but God gives his grace to complete the work. Prelates should beware their pride, should ask for prayer, and should be mindful of their own sin, which leads them to compassion and charity to forgive those who sin and are to be disciplined as a result. Having said at the outset that Gregory doesn't offer a systematic theology of pastoral care, he does expend 44,000 words on the subject, and lessons can be learnt, though he clearly comes from a different age. For example, no one would agree with him that bishops should have big noses to better detect sin. Also, his exegesis is typically allegorical and medieval, and perhaps foreign to the modern age except to those interested in the history of hermeneutics, but it's not to be discarded without consideration. The Church of England is different from the Church in the early medieval period, with different expectations about how discipline should be exercised and what its aims are, as well as conflicting demands from inside the church and outside it. But the problem of how prelates pastor their people remains, and the gospel remains applicable to both the aims of discipline, to reconcile men and women to God, and to the methods of discipline. The Clergy Discipline Measure is a complex piece of legislation which interacts with the capability procedure and safeguarding, and is part of the pastoral duty of bishops. Dissatisfaction with the inflexibility of the Clergy Discipline Measure among bishops and archdeacons who operate it, and amongst the clergy and the laity, suggests that the replacement for the CDM should be less legalistic, simpler in operation, cheaper to run, and allow greater flexibility to those who operate it. Safeguarding brings different but related pressures from wider society upon those who administer discipline and those who are subject to it. Perhaps those differences should be reflected in the disciplinary policy or policies. The weaponizing of discipline in the Church is typical of big organizations, but contradicts the aims of the Church to build the kingdom of love and peace. A replacement should ensure that the vehicle for the exercise of discipline is consonant with the pastoral aims of that measure. Freedom should be given to bishops to deal with disciplinary issues flexibly, but the abuse of discipline should be an offence in itself. This presentation is presented as a ressourcement, a return to the sources, including the pastoral and practical theology of Gregory the Great. It's intended to enable those who carry such a heavy burden today to know that as they follow their master, they walk in the footsteps of giants. Gregory teaches humility and charity in the exercise of discipline. He teaches that discipline should be flexible, varying according to the character and lifestyle of the one to be disciplined. He teaches that penalties suitable for one person are unsuitable for another, even with everything else being the same. He teaches the need to consider the lifestyle of the one to be disciplined, so that a view of the whole person is taken into consideration, not as mitigation, but as part of pastoral care, and in order to understand what motivates them and how to discipline them. He teaches the need to treat minor and major infractions differently. He does not disregard minor infractions that are repeated. Gregory speaks plainly and authoritatively. For Gregory, discipline should not separate man from God. By analogy, a disciplinary policy for today should not be so harsh as to cause PTSD, depression, or suicidal ideation. Gregory expected prelates not to lose their tempers. We might expect them not to display exasperation, and not to use threats of discipline to ensure that clergy behaviour is altered. Among other lessons to be learnt is the need to consider state of mind in judging sin. Whether an action is sinful or not is dependent not just on the action, but on the state of mind and the intention of the actor. At this point, clergy discipline interacts with bullying and well-being policies. The balance between punishing the sin and forgiving the sinner is currently in the wrong place. Separating sinner from sin in their minds could help senior clerics practice loving mercy and forgiveness. Love, charity, and equality matter. For Gregory, the duty of the bishop in the exercise of discipline is primarily pastoral. He advises that it be done with kindness, love, and charity, mindful of the common humanity that prelate and priest share, and the image of God within the soul to be disciplined.